Hello everyone and welcome back to Flashback Fridays. For now I'm sticking with the Star Wars theme and I'm going all the way back to Kenner's 12-inch line from the 1990s. And this is one of the very first figures in that initial wave. It is of course Obi Wan Kenobi. Now, I've covered quite a lot of the Kenner 12-inch figures on my channel already, but none from this initial first wave. So this is a little bit special actually. This is of course the wave that brought the 12-inch line back after having been off the shelves for a good number of years at this point. And it was something of a relaunch, a revamp, and also testing the waters a little bit at this point. And for the most part, these early figures and these early waves were essentially reissues of what had gone before. The lineup is pretty much identical to what was released all those years ago in the 70s and 80s, but revamped with new bodies and new fabrics and new details. And of course, brand new packaging. And for me personally, to this date, I actually think this initial branding, this style of packaging, the design, the approach they took to this is actually still my favourite after all these years, despite all the numerous waves we subsequently would get across this series and then subsequently from the Hasbro. I really like that they've opted for a production still of the character from the film, and they've made that a really large, vibrant image on the front of this packaging. It's really pleasing to me that this actually has a gatefold cover, which I will look at in a minute, but it's really nice that it has this front cover. I think this looks really, really nice, particularly with this use of background as well. I love how they've actually made this really colourful and fun and interesting. We have the Starfield behind Obi-Wan here, but of course we also have the Death Star, and we have TIE fighters as well. And then at the bottom of the packaging, you'll notice in the right hand corner there's this gold foil Rebel Alliance sticker as well, which serves no function whatsoever, but it's very attractive and it's really cool, especially when you're a kid. There's something kind of special about this. If we flip the packaging and look at the side panel, we can see they've utilised that same image again. Again, we also have the Starfield in the background there. But this looks pretty attractive. If you want to stack these figures up on your shelf side by side, then each one has its own personality, it's distinct and pretty much uniform as well in terms of shape and size, which looks really cool. Then when we flip to look at the back of the packaging, this is a lot more pared down. There's not as much going on here. Essentially the back card is just a blank black void, but we have the Star Wars logo at the top, we have a little bit of blurb about the series, and then we have the other figures available in this collection. And of course we can see some classic entries here, including Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, and Chewbacca. Now, I've always noted that I thought this is a really interesting approach. Rather than showing the figures themselves, they're actually just showing the character image, which added an element of mystery for me as a kid, wondering what these figures would actually look like, knowing that I just wanted to have these characters. And then finally we have that gatefold cover. So when we open the cover up, we have on the right hand side a window display displaying this figure in all of his glory there, looking pretty cool. There is a blue insert in tray to really help the figure pop, especially when his colours are brown and white, contrasting quite nicely against that deep blue. And then on the left hand side we have this image of the character supported by some pretty lengthy text explaining the plot of the film and the character's role within it. Now, in terms of presentation, this looks absolutely fantastic, and it's almost like they were thinking ahead when they were making this toy about making it collector friendly for adult collectors as well as children, which was a smart move because I still think after all these years this still looks really, really fun to children, but it's also nice to display as an adult as well. So I've been very fortunate to track down a brand new unopened version of this figure. I never actually owned one when I was a kid, so I was super excited to actually finally get my hands on one. And I have to say, despite having some initial reservations because I know how simple this initial first wave was, I'm actually quite impressed with this figure. If we start off by looking at the head sculpt, I actually think they've done a pretty nice job with this. Now, certainly this line can be criticised for having quite soft likenesses generally speaking, but I think this is definitely one of the stronger ones. I think they've done a pretty nice job of capturing Alec Guinness's likeness here, and it looks pretty authentic. Sure, you could argue that the eyes are maybe a little bit too big and a little bit too dark, but otherwise I think they've actually done a pretty nice job capturing the detail of the hairstyle, the beard, and actually having a little bit of a wash running through these as well, just to give it a little bit more depth and texture. I think this is actually quite sophisticated for the time. I'm also really impressed with this cloak. It's very nicely tailored, so it fits to him quite snugly, but it's made of a thick, coarse material, and it just works really well. Likewise, his hood on top of his head, which can be lifted up or down, just fits to his head very, very nicely, pretty much pitch perfect really, which I'm really impressed with. Likewise, if we look underneath the cloak and look at the tunic there, we have a separate material which I think is really nice. It has that rubber belt as well, and then underneath that there is another layer. There's actually another body stocking underneath, which I think is really cool. And that rings true for the rest of the figure as well. So having this extra depth, having this extra material was actually something of a surprise that I wasn't expecting, and I think it's a nice extra touch, them going the extra mile like this. Now, one thing I do have to acknowledge is that he does of course have those unfortunate rubber boots, which I'm not a huge fan of. These figures really struggle to stand independently on their own. They tend to reuse these boots, they tend to look out of scale, they look out of proportion, and they look a little bit clumsy. Now, for the most part, this is hidden quite nicely by his cloak, so I'm not complaining too much. But in a similar vein, we also have the issue of his hands as well. Now, his arms are made entirely of rubber, they're all one piece, and this certainly does compromise the articulation, which we'll take a look at shortly. But as you can see, his hands are permanently molded in these big gripping hands. These are essentially the same hands on every single figure in this line up to a certain point, and they don't really work particularly well for Obi Wan Kenobi. It just looks a little bit out of proportion and a little bit apish, I suppose. Okay, so let's look at the articulation then. He has a straight swivel at the top of the neck there, so he can spin his head all the way around, but there's no ball joint here, so he can't lean it left and right, he can't nod his head forwards or backwards. He does have ball joints in his shoulders, so he can lift his arms all the way up and out, which is fantastic, but that's basically it. There is no more articulation here. As I mentioned, his arms are made of rubber, and if you really want to force it, it's very resistant, but you could get it to just about bend a little bit and maybe hold that pose, but it's not really the best. You're going to really struggle with this. Now, there's no waist articulation whatsoever, but there is a ball joint in the hips. The legs will kick out to the side, they'll kick forwards, and they'll kick backwards, and the legs are also made of rubber, but these are a little bit more pliable so that you can sort of just about bend them and lock them into this sort of 90-degree position. Now, I must confess I was a little bit surprised and disappointed by his lightsaber. For a start, although it's nicely moulded, it is another rubber piece, and it's all cast in black, which is pretty strange. If nothing else, it should have been silver, so this seems like a really odd choice. I'm not sure why they did this. As I said, it's kind of rubber as well, so it doesn't feel very nice. It looks a little bit strange all in all. The blue of the lightsaber blade itself is pretty nicely done. It is a translucent plastic, so it catches the light quite nicely and it creates that effect, which is great. But it doesn't seem to be removable. It seems to be fairly stuck in place here, and I do know that obviously later action figures in this line would have a removable blade so that you could easily attach the hilt of the lightsaber onto the belt of the action figure. Now, you still can do that, as you can see here. It does have the hook at the end of the lightsaber, and indeed there is that hook on the belt there for it to latch onto, but with the blade still attached, this looks pretty weird. So there you have it. Now overall, I must admit, I have some mixed feelings about this figure. It seems to be a figure that has dramatic highs and lows. I really like the likeness, I love the fabric, I love the attention to detail in that fabric and how they've gone the extra mile with it to just give us lots of layers and lots of textures, which I think is absolutely phenomenal for this time especially. And then we have the issue of the poor articulation, the rubbery body, and of course the lightsaber, which is just a little bit off kilter, wrong colouring, and that you can't remove the lightsaber blade is just a little bit disappointing. So all in all, it's a very nice figure. It's definitely a nice one to put on display with the other figures in this line, but as a fun figure to play with as a child, I'm guessing it probably wouldn't have been that impressive. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.